sorry. The, not on. Well, Michael's working his magic. We're going to be covering Acts the 23rd chapter today, and Scott did a great job of leading us into it from Acts the 22nd chapter. Now, I want to say something before I get into this. There's some things that we can draw from the scriptures about some of this stuff, and I will try to always say, well, I think, or I believe, or whatever. And there's what we call inferences from the Bible, and there's weak inferences, meaning that, and there's strong inferences, which the Bible tends to imply very strongly certain things, and then there's necessary inferences, and that's basically any reasonable explanation. This is the only reasonable explanation that we could draw from these scriptures and such. Some of these things that, like I say, as I go through them, I'll try to tell you, I'll try to use the right language because I don't want to say something that the scriptures don't actually say, but there is a lot in this chapter that we can draw certain things from, and some of the male brethren might want to comment on some of those things as well. The first thing that we want to talk about, though, is we want to remember what the Apostle Paul is accused of, okay? And Scott brought this out very well in the first, in Acts the 22nd chapter and everything. But you remember in the 21st chapter, they cried out, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone, everywhere, against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." That's what he is accused of. That's what's got everybody in an uproar about. And in that uproar, they beat him, and of course, the commander, some say tribune, the actual Greek word is Kiliarch, came down and drug him out of that and took him into the fortress of Antonia. Some say the barracks, but that's where he was taken in. And if you remember, he was bound and threatened to be beat, and they find out he's a Roman citizen, and we'll get into that. So one of the things we want to do before we get too far into this, because we'll move really quickly through these scriptures and everything, but we want to have an understanding of what I want to say, the cast of characters, okay? And of course, the Apostle Paul is the first one. He was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and he is therefore a Roman citizen. That played strongly in the chapter that Scott just went over. It will play strongly in this chapter as well, and it will play strongly really throughout the rest of the book of Acts, because as a Roman citizen, he had certain rights. He had certain privileges, and in those rights and privileges, one of them was that he could not be beaten, nor could he be bound as a Roman citizen without due process. Now, what that also meant was if you weren't a Roman citizen, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted to, and there was no problem with that. But if you were a Roman citizen, it was a tremendous violation, and you could get in serious trouble for violating those rights. So that plays an important part in this. Claudius Lucius, and that's the way they would pronounce it back then. We would say Claudius Lysias or something like that, but it would be pronounced back then Claudius Lucius. I'll pronounce it 3 or 4 ways before we're all through this. He's referred to as a commander or tribune. Again, the actual word is a Kiliarch. And he was a leader of 1,000 men, meaning that he had centurions under him that were leaders of hundreds of men. And his name is finally given to us later on in the chapter when he sends a letter to, as we would say, Felix, but they would say Felix. When he sends a letter to the governor, okay? He plays an important role in this as well. And I'll say here now that the more I read this chapter, and as you read various commentators, they will either have a very high opinion of the man or a very low opinion of the man based on the events that occurred. But the more I read through this, all I really got from it was more sympathy for the man than anything. As we'll see. He's already run into a situation in the 22nd chapter where he was caught almost flogging a Roman citizen, being the Apostle Paul. Well, that's not good. We're not advancing here, so let's try this again. Okay. Now, the Pharisees, and we're pretty much familiar with the Pharisees, but we're going to kind of go over it a little bit because Luke does too as well. The Pharisees strictly adhered to the Talmud. That was the religious tradition and interpretations of the law, and they believed in angels and spirits and the afterlife and the resurrection of the dead. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. He was the son of Pharisees. He said he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And so that is what they believed. Now, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in spirits. They did not believe in life after death, which is sad, you see. Okay. I know, y'all are all waiting for that to come. But there were an elite upper class, generally wealthy sect that did not believe in these things. And they became the high priest of the New Testament, and they were arrogant and rude. Okay, now you say, well, where did you come up with that? Well, there's a couple of sources. Josephus in Morris 2:8-14 says the behavior of the Sadducees one towards another is in some degree wild, and their conversation with those that are of their own party is as barbarous as if they were strangers to them. They treated everybody this way, even their own party, according to Josephus. We have a great example of this in John, the 11th chapter. He says, so the chief priests and Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, Sadducee, you know nothing at all. Wow. The arrogance is just dripping. Nor do you understand that it is better that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. So we have a good example of that. This is who they were. We're going to find out, we're going to see some of that arrogance play out in this as well. Sanhedrin plays a part in this. It was 70 elders and a high priest that sat as a tribunal. They formerly met in the second temple period in the hall of hewn stone that was built into the north wall of the temple, half inside the sanctuary and half out of it. Now, this kind of plays a little bit of a role, because you can see the temple here, and this is the court of the Gentiles, and this is the fortress of Antonio, and such. And this section right here, this wall, you can see is blown up, and that is the chamber of hewn stone. That is where the 70 elders would sit. And the high priest would sit in a special chair in the midst of them. That's where the Sanhedrin sat. And you can see half of it was literally into the sanctuary itself. Okay? And you remember, no Gentile would be allowed in this area here at all. We're going to come back to this picture in a few minutes, but you can kind of keep that in mind. But that's the Sanhedrin, and that's where they met. Now, Ananias, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, was high priest, and I've got sort of, okay? And the reason I say that is because Quadratus, who preceded Felix, had appointed Jonathan as high priest in place of Ananias, who had been placed in the office in 48 AD. Now, this is all occurring in approximately 58 AD, 10 years later. But Jonathan had been put in the place of Ananias, and that's what happened. The governors would appoint the high priest, and they would appoint high priests at various times, and Ananias was the high priest, and then Felix comes along and appoints Jonathan as high priest in his place. Well, Josephus tells us in true Sadducean arrogance that Felix also bore an ill will to Jonathan, the high priest, because he frequently gave him admonitions about governing the Jewish affairs better than he did. Now, that's probably not a wise thing to do as high priest, okay, is to tell the governor who appointed you that you know better how to judge the Jewish people than he does. And we're also told by Josephus that he threatened on numerous occasions to go to Caesar and complain to him about that. Well, Felix didn't take well to this, and without going into a lot of detail, just had him murdered. Okay, so there was no high priest at that time, and as a result, Ananias was a default high priest, so to speak. And later on, Agrippa would come in and he would appoint a high priest in place of the default high priest of Ananias. So I say high priest, sort of, okay? So, Antonius Felix, as they would say, he was called by the general term of governor. He was married 3 times. We're told, according to Tacitus, that he was powerful and unprincipled. He writes, with all cruelty and lust, he exercised the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. Now, when he says that, the reason he says what he does there is Felix and his brother Pallas were originally slaves, and they became freedmen in the house of a noble Roman lady, Antonia, who was the mother of Claudius Caesar. Okay, so Pallas became the favorite, and he became the secretary of the treasurer of the emperor, and in 52 AD secured the post of procurator of Judea for his brother Felix. So they were slaves, they became freedmen, and he had the protection of his brother, so to speak, who had the ear of the emperor, okay, and he felt like he could do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. Thus Tacitus says that he ruled with all cruelty and lust, but with the spirit of a slave. He didn't have any tact about him, shall we say. So, we're going to start back up here, and we'll go through these verses fairly quickly because, again, there's not just a lot of comment per se. But in Acts, the 22nd chapter, the last 2 verses, it says, those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune also was afraid, for he had realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. They also almost flogged him, as we remember. So he realized he had bound him. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet him. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. Now, a couple of things we want to point out here is you say, well, he had bound him, but then the next day he unbound him. That's probably not the best translation of that particular word, because it really means freed or loosed, as opposed to untying and unbinding. Okay, it seems here's one of those areas where we're talking about what I would say is a strong implication of the scriptures. Okay, not necessary, but I would say strong, is that it would be, in my mind, unrealistic for him to realize that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him up and then continue to leave him bound all night into the next day, compounding his error. Okay? So I think the idea here, and there are several commentators that state that, is basically when he says he freed him or he loosed him, in essence, he loosed him from staying in the barracks area. Okay? And so he commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down, this is important, to meet them and set him before them. So where did they meet? Okay? And this, I believe, plays a part into it, and this is what I think concerning that. I believe that they probably met somewhere in this area here, not in the chamber of hewn stone. And I think that for a number of reasons. Number one, Paul is going to have trouble identifying Ananias as the high priest. The high priest would always sit in a particular spot. He would always be well known by the robes that he wore. Okay? And this was not a trial. And we need to keep that in mind. This was not a trial. Lucius, as commander, would not compound his mistake of having a Roman citizen tried by a Jewish court. Okay? He wanted to ascertain what the problem was. He is a Roman. He doesn't understand the Jewish religion. He does not understand what went on the day before. He's trying to figure out what in the world these people are doing trying to kill Paul. So he calls them, they don't call him. He calls them to meet. So Paul comes, commander, Lucius, and Paul, nobody else is mentioned, come down, and they probably meet somewhere in here. You'll also find out that some of them were standing. They would not have stood in a tribunal. They all had their seats. They all had places. Some of them were standing. So I think this was a very informal meeting. He wants to know what's going on. He calls the religious leaders of the day and says, look, I want to understand what is happening here. Okay? So they probably met informally here, according to my concerns and such. And so, looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, there are some that will look at this and say, looking intently at the council, they surmise Paul had problems with his vision and he was struggling to see people maybe he knew, maybe he didn't. But this same Greek words are used in Acts 13:9 and Acts 14:9. And I'll not go there and look at those, but they have nothing to do with that. It just simply means looking intently. He's looking at the council. It's been 20 plus years since he's probably seen some of these, but in new faces, probably our faces he recognizes. But he looks intently at the council. He is trying to determine, I think, if he's got any chance at all of presenting his case. You can find out pretty quick. The answer to that is no. Okay? He says, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, when he says this, some commentators believe that what he is saying is, I lived my life in good conscience up to this day in regards to those accusations that have been made against me, not necessarily in his persecution of the church. Others say he lived in good conscience, okay, and even in persecuting the church. Now, the high priest and council couldn't say that because in the trial of Jesus, they lied, they perjured witnesses, they put forth false witnesses, and they simply were intent on murder. So was that Paul involved in that? Well, no, but there's a difference there, and I don't know that it makes much difference and such. But he's stating that he's lived in all good conscience up to this day. Now, I want to say this much about the conscience, because the Bible talks about it. We're not going to go through all the verses, but the Bible talks about a weak conscience. It talks about a strong conscience, and it talks about a seared conscience. Okay? The conscience is something that has to be trained. Okay? Paul, I am sure, even in persecuting the church, thought what he was doing was right. And he probably could say, I lived in good conscience towards God, even though finding out later it was wrong. But he certainly, in terms of the charges that we outlined at the beginning, he could definitely say, I've lived in good conscience. I've never done anything like that. I would never do anything like that. But this is as far as he gets. For the third verse, oops, I skipped a verse. I'm sorry. That's what happens when you don't walk through every one of them. So the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him. Again, they were not seated. Another indication it was informal, maybe there in front. But stood by them to strike him on the mouth. So he no more than gets. He no more than gets a few words out of his mouth than Ananias, in his arrogance, and you don't know what the guy's thinking. Is he trying to prove his power? Was he offended that the Apostle Paul said, I've lived in good conscience? I don't know. It's all kinds of speculations. You can read all kinds of speculations. But he says, hit him. Strike him in the mouth. Well, some say that he did get struck. Others say he didn't. The Bible doesn't say. Doesn't say at all. Okay? So maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But the Apostle Paul responds to him and he said, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Whew. The Greek is even stronger because the high priest said, strike him on the mouth. The Greek says, strike you, God. So he goes back with almost the same terminology. So, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. In other words, you hypocrite. Jesus used the same kind of terminology concerning them. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, order me to be struck? Well, I'm sure that was not lost on the people there. The Apostle Paul knew the law, and what was just done there was a violation of the law. But you've got to remember the Sadducees didn't really care much about the law. Okay? They thought this life is all there is, and you just kind of disappear. In fact, they really didn't have a problem with how you lived your life, according to Josephus. But the Apostle Paul states this, and I'm sure that got their attention. It certainly probably got the Pharisees' attention because they lived in strict adherence to the law. Okay? Those who stood by, again, those standing, would you revive God's high priest? And this is where it comes in. How did he not know it was God, that it was high priest? Well, we have it out of the history. Ananias was not the official high priest, number one. Number two, he probably wasn't. Again, the speculation, probably wasn't in his priestly robes because, again, this is not an official gathering, okay? And he was probably, again, not sitting where the high priest sits. He would have known, had all of those things been taking place, that this was a high priest in his high priestly robes and sitting in the high priest chair. But he didn't, okay? And, again, Ananias was not, he was kind of default, high priest. And the Apostle Paul, let's face it, hadn't been around for several years. He's been out on his missionary journeys. And Paul said, I did not know, brother, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Again, the Apostle Paul is demonstrating that he is a strict adherent to the law in every way, shape, and form. He is going to strictly adhere to the law, whether they do or not. Now, the priest was wrong. The high priest was wrong. The high priest, Apostle Paul was right in pointing that out. But he's going to strictly adhere to the law. And he would have, in basically the way of saying, if I had known that, I would have just taken it. because that's what the law says. You're not speaking evil of the Lord. And that, of course, comes from Exodus 22nd chapter, 28th verse. So the Apostle Paul knew the law. He was going to strictly adhere to it. And he's been saying to them all along, I did none of these things because I have adhered to the law. Well, now when Paul perceived that one part was Sadducees and the other is Pharisees, now he knew that all along. Okay. But it's one of those things that I'm sure it's like, okay, I've got Pharisees here and I've got Sadducees here. The Sadducees are not going to let me have an opportunity. And I believe that as happened in the previous chapter, as Scott pointed out, the Apostle Paul is always one to be able to find some commonality with the people he's speaking with. And I think that that's what he's trying to do here. He's trying to find some commonality. He will not find it with the Sadducees. He's already seen that. They're going to shut him down. They're going to violate the law in any way they can, but he doesn't have a chance with them. And he's trying to find some commonality. Just like in the previous chapter, when he spoke to the people there, just like on Mars Hill, he tried to find some commonality with the people he was speaking to. I see that you're religious people. And here's an altar to an unknown God. I want to tell you about that God. So he tries to find something there. And I think that that's what he's trying to do here. I do not personally think that what he set out to do was to cause a riot. Okay? I don't believe that that's the kind of person the Apostle Paul was. But I think that he, again, tries to point out, brothers, okay, forget the Sadducees, turns to the Pharisees. Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am being judged. It says on trial. He's not on trial. Again, that's another translation that probably would be better as translated as the word actually is, and that is being judged. And he was being judged for what he said. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am being judged. Now, possibly, I don't know, I really don't, but I like to think that the Apostle Paul, if he would have had the chance, would have gone on and preached the gospel to them, just like he tried to do the previous day in Acts the 22nd chapter that Scott told us about last week. But never got the chance. Maybe he wasn't, I don't know, but that's just kind of the way that's probably not an influence, but that's the way I think. Anyway, and when he had said this, a dissension rose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So, they could get together, and the Sadducees and Pharisees could get together and judge certain things and rule Israel and do certain things and everything. But when it came to this issue, they were in sharp dispute, and they did not get along. And the Apostle Paul brings this out. He turns to the Pharisees and he says, I need some commonality. I got to have a chance here. And it says a dissension arose. And when the dissension became violent, and really, again, this word is when the dissension became great or huge or massive. Now, is violent a bad translation? I don't necessarily think so. A lot of them translated that. It obviously did get violent. Okay? Because it says, the tribune afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. This turned nasty real quick. Okay? And I don't think that that's what the Apostle Paul intended, but you're dealing with a group here of people that don't get along in most cases when it comes to this thing. He commanded the soldiers to, says go down, come down or descend and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Again, violence is implied. And again, move down, descend. They're in the barracks. And as we pointed out, if it was in that area that we're talking about, that would tend to make sense. He doesn't have a bunch of soldiers with him. And it doesn't make much sense that he would have to run all the way across the court of the Gentiles and drag them all the way back. It makes more sense that he would simply call them down and rescue the Apostle Paul. So that ends in disaster. And you can see now why I'm beginning to have a great deal of sympathy for Lucius here, because every time he tries to determine something, it goes wrong. He's going to flog the Apostle Paul to find out what's happening. He finds out he's a Roman citizen. He finds out that they put him in chains. And he's scared over that, but he's got to find out what's going on. He brings the Sanhedrin together, and it ends in a tumult that he's got to rescue the Apostle Paul for a second time. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you've testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also in Rome." Jesus gives him a great deal of encouragement and says, "You've done my will here in Jerusalem, but you're going to do it in Rome. That's where you've always wanted to go." Romans, first chapter, 9th verse, he says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with the Spirit, in the gospel of the Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers." The Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans, he says, "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gifts to strengthen you, that is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles." Verse 15, "So I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." He wanted to go there, and Jesus says, "You will. You're going to preach the gospel in Rome." So it had to be a great encouragement. Well, things don't go the right way here again. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune, Lucius, to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly." Okay? "And we are ready to kill him before he comes here." Now, strictly bound ourselves by an oath. The Greek here is a word that we're familiar with, anathema, they would say, and anathema, anathematizo. So they cursed themselves. In essence, what they're saying, we've cursed ourselves with a curse. This is how strong this is. It's a strong language here. We've cursed ourselves with a curse that we're going to kill him or we won't eat food or drink. They must have wasted away. Anyway, so again, this is my surmisings, okay, based on that. This time I think that they do want him brought. Bring him to us, and they would have to cross this entire area here, and it would give 40 plus men easily a chance to kill Paul. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went into the barracks and told Paul. We know nothing about Paul's sister, and we know nothing about his nephew. This is it. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." Now, I want to stop here. Notice he entered the barracks and went to Paul. Okay? As some commentators, they want him locked away in some inner room in a jail cell. But that would be against the Roman spirit of things. But he's got Roman rights. He's being held in the barracks, but his nephew, from these scriptures, appears to just walk in and walk up to him and talk to him. That would be equivalent to what happens when he goes to Rome. When he goes to Rome, he lives in a rented house. And he has a guard. But people come in and they go, and he comes and preaches to them and they go. And that seems to be the way it was going to be. It seems to be the way here. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, Lucius, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you." Notice that Paul, the prisoner, called him. Centurion, come here, you know. He has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand. And I think that's significant. I can imagine this young man, however old he was, I mean, he's going up against the Roman Kiliarch here and everything, and he's being hauled right up to the head guy. He may have been shaking a little, I don't know. But the Kiliarch grabs him by the hand and takes him aside. I don't know, I see that as an act of kindness myself. And asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, or who have bound themselves by an oath either to eat or drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." His life would be in danger. He wants to make sure the young man's taken care of. Then he called two of his centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea," as they would say, Caesarea. But I say Caesarea because I can never remember how they say it. Caesarea, as they would say it, at the third hour of the night, 9 o'clock at night. And also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring them safely to Felix the governor. Now, he's going to make sure, there's more than 40 of them. There are 470 plus the two centurions, 472. He's going to make sure Paul's taken care of here. Okay? Now, this word spearman here, we really don't know what that is. It could be soldiers that carry spears. It could be slingers. It is those who carry something in their right hand. That's the word, so to speak. So we don't know exactly what it is. We just know that they were soldiers and they were probably not anybody you want to mess with. So. And to provide mounts, this is beast of burdens, okay? That's all it is. It could be horses, it could be donkeys, but you provide something for him to ride because they are going fast. Okay? And the reason we know that they are going to go fast is because it is 42 miles from Jerusalem to Antipatris and another 26 miles to Caesarea. Okay? And they got there by morning. Now, there are some that say, "There's no way. Can't walk that fast." Well, they really don't understand Roman troops. A soldier had to demonstrate. I've got to read this. Okay, had to demonstrate that he could do a loaded march. Now, loaded march, they weren't doing a loaded march. They did not need supplies and that kind of stuff. A loaded march is with 45 pounds. They had to do 24 Roman miles, 22 of our miles, in what they termed 5 summer hours, it'd be 6 hours. 22 miles loaded with 45 pounds in 5 hours. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so yes, they definitely could have done it, but they were moving at a fairly quick speed. You know, the criminality of the Sanhedrin and the Sadducees is just almost unbelievable. But that's what we're dealing with here. Now, he writes a letter in which he says, "Claudius Lucius," this is where he first hears his name, "to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon him with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen." Ooh, that's a real stretch of the facts there. But, you know, he's not going to indict himself. Okay. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found out that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. Now, that's significant. He has done nothing deserving death or imprisonment because it was questions about their law. You remember, and I have it up here, but I'm going to skip by it. You remember when they were hauled before Gallio, proconsul, Gallio found out it was questions about the Jewish law, and he said, I ain't going to hear it. Has nothing to do with Rome. Okay? He could have done the very same thing, and might have, except that there's a plot to kill this man. So I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So basically, he says, I'm just trying to protect him and sending him to you. And so soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by that night to Antipatrice. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they'd come to Caesarea, delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now, he asked about where he's from because it's a matter of jurisdiction. The occurrence occurred in Jerusalem, which was under his jurisdiction. If this turns out to be something else, then it might go to the governor of Syria. But he's going to hear it. And he commands him to be guarded in Herod's palace. Okay? I think that the same circumstances that we've seen here or seen in Rome, that's what I think. Anyway, we are at the end of that chapter, and I'll open it up for any comments by any of the brethren.
I'm just kind of curious, why do you think there were people, some of the soldiers were on the ground, and said they sent the horsemen back? I just assumed that all of them were on horses.
No, there would be foot soldiers. They had horsemen, and then they had the other soldiers, which most of the commentators say were foot soldiers. And Dwayne, I said comments. Yeah, I didn't want you to ask a question. Okay. Let me get back there let me go back there. Okay. Sorry. Okay. There were 200 soldiers, okay, and 70 horsemen. So the assumption, and I think this is a good assumption, is they weren't necessarily horsemen. They would not have been on horses. Most of the Roman army did not travel on horse. Most of the Roman army walked. Only the more elite were of the cavalry. So that's my answer. Best I can do. Anything else?
Yes. Amazing job. You did a great, great job. I don't have any questions nor even any comments on chapter 23. I have this little Greek translator's handbook, and they explained it just like you did. And that is the last verse of Acts 22, verse 30. They explained here, they said this verse is explained by reading chapter 23. Just what you've done, you've laid out. So that's the explanation of the last verse of the previous chapter. And it was just, and as I followed along and I enjoyed doing that, everything I thought of saying, you just said it about 2 minutes later, so you brought a target. So I really thoroughly enjoyed that. It was very edifying. And I sincerely appreciate your study. It took a lot of study to come up with all that.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The only thing that I would add, something that you already alluded to, is the fact that if you want to call him governor, whatever, the fact that he's in the tower of Antonia, he called high priests and others. He wouldn't have gone to the Sanhedrin and called him. He would have called him to his tower. He is the reigning military, at that time there. So I think your point that the fact that they had to leave the area of the temple, go across cross, almost right on the wall. But,
That's an excellent point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Excellent. Any other comments for the McBride? I appreciate the comments and I appreciate the question.
I just didn't want a tough question, so
We never want to close the service without extending invitation that we have the opportunity here to obey the gospel. And that is the gospel that the Apostle Paul preached, the gospel that he preached everywhere he went. And that is if you believe and repent and confess and are baptized, you can have the salvation that is so freely offered to all of us. And if you're of that class, we urge you to come. If you need the prayers of the church for any reason, we urge you to come. Stand and sit.